1940. German troops crossed the border and invaded Danish territory without resistance. But unlike much of Europe, where silence and complicity enabled genocide, this country chose another path. In that small Scandinavian kingdom, a remarkable feat was born. When the shadow of the Holocaust threatened to wipe out the Jewish population, a network of solidarity, cunning, and courage protected the vast majority. Of the roughly 7,800 Jews living under occupation, more than 95% survived. But how did they manage this in the midst of Nazi terror and barbarity? The answer lies in a story of civil resistance, moral choices, and a nation that, in the face of horror, chose to act. Let us uncover how Denmark defied the Third Reich and saved thousands of lives.
Germany occupies Copenhagen. Hitler's troops, disembarking from transports in the harbor, carry out the Führer's latest act of aggression, the invasion of peaceful and innocent Denmark. Actually, it's not a bombing raid, but the planes are dropping leaflets ordering the people to remain calm, to cooperate with the army of occupation, and to carry on as normally as possible.
April 9th, 1940. While Europe burned under the Nazi war machine, Denmark awoke to a lightning invasion. Without warning, German troops crossed the border by land, sea, and air. Within hours, the small Scandinavian nation was occupied. But what followed was not the classic script of brutality and repression that Germany imposed elsewhere. The Danes chose an unusual strategy, not resistance with weapons, but diplomacy. The government, aware of its military weakness and the human cost of confronting the Wehrmacht, accepted a negotiated occupation. In exchange for cooperation, the Germans allowed Parliament and King Christian X to remain in office. The Danish flag continued to fly, and the institutions remained intact. Life went on, at least on the surface. Denmark became the country that surrendered sovereignty to protect its people. Within that fragile balance between apparent obedience and national dignity, a form of silent resistance took root. During the first 3 years of occupation, the Danes managed to avoid the imposition of the Third Reich's anti-Semitic policies. Jews were not forced to wear the yellow star, nor confined to ghettos, nor deported. While in Poland, France, or the Netherlands, trains departed relentlessly for Auschwitz. In Denmark, Jews continued to live as ordinary citizens. The government consistently refused to hand over lists, approve discriminatory laws, or accept racial measures. And the Nazis, needing stability in a strategic region, tolerated the defiance.
Unlike German occupation policy elsewhere in Europe, at first their rule in Denmark was relatively benign. This was necessary because Denmark exported a lot of essential supplies to Germany, especially food. They also saw Danes as fellow proper Aryans. This model of occupation, or the model protectorate, meant that Denmark could keep its entire government, police, and civil service. There were also minimal restrictions on ordinary people, unlike in the rest of Nazi-occupied Europe.
But the calm was only a truce. In 1943, the arrangement collapsed. The Danish resistance, which had been growing in the shadows, began to carry out acts of sabotage. Tensions escalated, and Germany demanded tighter control. Denmark refused, and unwilling to become complicit in what was coming, the government resigned. For the first time, the occupation was no longer cordial. The Gestapo, now in absolute control, arrived with lists. Jews were once again in the crosshairs. The time of protection was over. Behind the scenes, the Nazi regime had already made its decision: eliminate the Jewish problem in Denmark. The date was set, the plan drawn up in silence. German troops began moving slowly, preparing the ground. They gathered information, waiting for October 1st, the night they would sweep through the city. They intended to end the Danish miracle.
Over late August and September, there were a couple of incidents that sparked fear throughout the Danish Jewish population. In one incident, the premises belonging to the Jewish community were searched by the Gestapo for lists, indexes, books, family trees, anything that would help the Germans to identify Danish Jews, since, unlike in other countries, they had not been forced to register with authorities, made to wear a yellow star, or carry identity cards marked with the letter J.
It seemed all was lost. But then something happened. A whisper saved thousands of lives, and it came from the very heart of the Third Reich. The man who warned the resistance of Adolf Hitler's plan was Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, German diplomat in Denmark and member of the Nazi Party. For years, he had observed the occupation in this small country. And when he learned of the orders to capture all Danish Jews, he could not remain silent. It was September 28, 1943. In 3 days, Denmark's Jews would be arrested and deported to concentration camps. Risking everything, Duckwitz sought out his contacts and leaked the information. Within hours, the news spread everywhere. Leaders of the Jewish community, priests, doctors, students, farmers, fishermen, all began to mobilize. With no structures, no prearranged plan. Only with courage and determination, they formed a spontaneous network of civil resistance. Entire families were hidden in homes, basements, hospitals, and churches.
So, on the 1st of October, when German police and Danish SS volunteers knocked on the doors of Danish Jews, they found that the majority were not there. Unlike elsewhere in Western Europe, the Nazis were specifically ordered not to force their way into homes or damage property. This meant that the Germans were only able to make around 500 arrests. This included elderly Jews who had been unable to flee, and those in the provinces who hadn't been alerted to the danger. The other 7,000 Danish Jews were already in hiding, with friends, neighbours, sometimes even strangers.
There were no orders, no designated leaders. There were no guarantees either. But there was resolve. When the warning came, thousands of Danes knew they could not remain passive, not for politics or religion, but for humanity. Without expecting rewards, not even knowing if they would be punished, they acted. Across neighborhoods, strangers opened their doors to Jewish families who had been only neighbors, clients, or colleagues. Doctors issued false diagnoses. Priests hid people in hollow pews, but hiding them was not enough. They had to be taken out of the country, and so began the journey toward hope. Night after night, groups of Jews were secretly moved to the coast. They walked in the shadows in small groups, evading German patrols. Some arrived by train, others in carts, and others on foot. At the docks, boats awaited them. Fishing vessels, small boats, and humble craft ready to sail toward freedom.
In 1943, Henny Sinding was just 19. There are no known photos of her, but in just a few months, she helped dozens and dozens of Danish Jews escape. Based in Copenhagen, she turned her father's small workboat into the most unlikely rescue ship of the Second World War. Its unassuming name was Goethe 3.
But it was not a safe journey. Some charged money, exploiting fear and uncertainty. The Nazis patrolled the waters. There were traitors and informers. But there were also fishermen who risked everything to save people they did not even know. The sea, once a border, became the path to salvation. Night after night, engines started in silence, ready to face strong waves and the unknown. They crossed the Øresund Strait, a stretch of water only a few kilometers wide, but in that moment, separating life from death. Those aboard the Goethe 3 knew the risk. Yet they decided it was better to venture into uncertainty in search of freedom than to wait for the certain brutality of the Third Reich.
About 20 people would be squeezed in with the cargo. But before Goethe 3 could leave Copenhagen, she had to be inspected by armed soldiers. It was a tense moment for those hiding below. Despite German patrols and hostile weather, Henny Sinding and her crew carried 300 Jews to safety.
On the other side was Sweden, where neutrality and asylum awaited. Warned by the Danes, the authorities opened their doors. Families were welcomed, registered, fed, and protected. They had escaped hell. In the silence of Europe, Denmark acted. It was a nation that refused to give up, that chose to save its people, and it proved that even in the deepest darkness, light can come from the simplest acts. It is estimated that more than 7,000 Jews escaped in barely 3 weeks. A clandestine operation, without weapons or violence, that directly defied one of the cruelest regimes in history. Denmark chose humanity over fear and became a symbol of moral resistance.
By the 9th of October, approximately 4,500 Jews from Denmark had reached Sweden, and by mid-October, around 7,200 had made it to safety, a total of 95% of Denmark's Jewish population. Part of the reason boats and ships were able to successfully cross the Øresund was because Danish and German coastal patrols did not intervene. But none of the Danish were aware of this. For the Danish Jews who were escaping and those helping them, the journey was full of fear, tension, and anxiety.
Yet even though civil resistance saved most Jewish families, not all managed to flee. When the Nazis launched their plan, house-to-house raids found empty doors, cold beds, and silent homes. But they also found around 470 Jews who had not managed to escape. They were not criminals or fugitives. They were elderly who could not move, the sick who did not understand what was happening, children separated from parents, people who had not heard in time. Some were betrayed, but the tragedy was not due to mass treason. It was the devastating fact that not everyone received the warning. They were arrested, gathered in schools or detention centers, and later deported to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in what is now the Czech Republic.
456 of the 476 Jews who had been arrested were transported to Germany. Then, mostly in cattle wagons, like the one behind me, were sent to the ghetto in Terezin, which the Nazis renamed Theresienstadt. The Nazis would attempt to deceive the world that Jews in Theresienstadt could live a normal life, which led to the ghetto gaining some amenities which were quite unusual for a ghetto. For example, there was a bank in Theresienstadt, which issued money and savings books. In reality, any money or savings were worthless.
For many, the name meant little. For others, it was synonymous with death. Theresienstadt was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, but it was part of the same system of dehumanization and cruelty. Extreme overcrowding, constant hunger, untreated diseases, fear that never slept. There, thousands of Jews from across Europe perished slowly, like shadows abandoned by the world. In other countries, deportation was a death sentence. But Denmark, even in this abyss, once again became an exception. Because the Danes did not forget their own. From occupied Copenhagen, from exile in Sweden, from fishing boats, the Danish people organized. Diplomatic pressure was relentless. The nearly dissolved government used what remained of its structure to demand answers from Berlin. Through the International Red Cross and other organizations, they sent packages with food, medicine, clothing, and books. An anomaly within the Nazi system. Danish prisoners were the only ones in Europe who received mail and steady aid from outside. In a system designed to erase identities, Denmark ensured its Jewish citizens were still treated as people. That difference was crucial. Amid starvation, each box of supplies was an act of resistance, and thanks to this, of the 470 captured, 423 survived. A figure that, in the context of the Holocaust, is almost a miracle. But this outcome was not due to luck. It was due to action, and to the symbol of a man who stood firm while Europe fell under the fist of the Third Reich, King Christian X. The elderly monarch embodied the entire Danish people. If he remained firm, so did the nation. He did not go into exile. He did not hide. Every morning, he mounted his horse and rode through the streets of Copenhagen without escort, without weapons, without speeches, only with his presence, silent, dignified, and firm. Christian X had no army, but he had moral authority, and that became the anchor of a nation. When the Germans demanded the imposition of anti-Jewish laws, his response was clear: "I have no Jewish citizens. I only have Danish citizens." This was more than a phrase. It was a line the Nazi regime did not dare to cross for 3 years. Denmark was not a nation armed against Hitler. It was a country shielded by morality. The king, together with his democratic government, refused to bow to racist pressure. Danish Jews were not segregated, not marked, not isolated. There were no yellow stars, no ghettos, no complicit silence. The message was clear. In Denmark, hatred would not become law.
And although resisting the German army was futile, Denmark stood firm against one of Hitler's key operations.
They insisted, we're going to keep your religious persecution out. We're not going to have your war against the Jews enter Danish soil.
The country was operating as a German protectorate, but it was still able to defend and protect its 8,000 Jewish citizens.
Still, even in an exemplary society, darkness crept in. In aristocratic salons, one figure caused discomfort: Princess Helena. Sister-in-law of the king and wife of the heir to the throne, she was a fervent admirer of Adolf Hitler. She wrote him letters, spoke openly in favor of Nazism, and her presence was a brutal contrast to the rest of the royal family. That is how she earned the nickname, the Nazi Princess. Though her influence was limited, her existence was a reminder that neutrality did not mean unanimity, and that even in the country that most protected its Jewish population, fanaticism could infiltrate. But Denmark chose another path. It chose the path of the king who rode alone, of a people who protected without fanfare, and of a government that resisted with laws and dignity for as long as it could. When the time came to count the survivors, the numbers spoke for themselves. 95% of Danish Jews survived, compared to 27% in the Netherlands, 25% in France, and barely 10% in Poland. In the history of the Holocaust, dominated by horror, indifference, and extermination, there are also chapters where humanity rose up, without rifles or uniforms, against the Nazi monster. Denmark was one of them. When evil became law, they chose disobedience. There were no soldiers, no miracles, but there were neighbors who hid, fishermen who crossed the sea, doctors who lied to save, and leaders who refused to surrender. In the darkest night, Denmark lit a flame that still shines, reminding us that even in the midst of absolute terror, decency can itself be resistance. And so we reach the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment and subscribe to the channel. Join us in our next episode as we continue exploring military history.